It's our first daytime event, actually. So there was a bit of a, oh my God, actually everything come from work. So it's really great to see everybody. We'd like some feedback though at the end. If day or evening works best for you, we're really conscious that there isn't a perfect answer, but please do feed in as we go. For those who I haven't met before, I'm Jo Butlin. I'm one of the founders of Women's Utility Network and one of the directors. And I will be chairing today's session, which is all about the balance of power and how the election will impact energy. We're really conscious it's a really sensitive subject, and so we're really wanting to be, we sort of gone, is it Chatham House rules or is it not Chatham House rules? And what we don't want to do is stifle conversation, but I want to be really, really clear up front that our panellists, who I will introduce them in a minute, are speaking for themselves. They're speaking their own opinions, they're not representing their companies. We want to have an open conversation, but really respectful of people's sort of personal positions and business positions. So hopefully we can sort of work within that boundary, we can have a really good conversation. We're delighted to be here as well. Thank you to Elexon for hosting us again. We really, really do depend on our partners for their support, and we're delighted to be here again. So I'm just going to talk about one for a minute. I know many of you have been to events before or involved in one already, but I just want to talk about where we are on our journey, which is continuing, and our whole purpose about everything in Women's Utility Network is about supporting women in their careers, which doesn't mean you've got to be a CEO in your career. It means actually whatever you want to be, we are there to support you. It seems to be resonating because we now have over 6,100 supporters and continuing to grow. So I think even in this month we've had about another 130, 150 in the first few days of the month. So we're really creating a movement and working together to really make something different in the industry. As like this, we have many events, and they're a mixture of this sort of event, which is sort of content-led, but also a lot of personal development events as well, and online and remote. And we started trying to get out of London. We had a fantastic one in Leeds a couple of weeks ago, so we're trying to expand that way as well. We have fantastic podcasts, and we've now got a library of over 40 podcasts, and we're growing about 1 month. And they're a complete range. A lot of them are women's stories, so many of us take a lot of comfort from actually saying we've had similar sort of challenges on our journeys. And actually we sort of talk within one of a tribe, and it's actually, if you feel that there are other people like you, it gets easier to manage through that. But also some fantastic podcasts on sort of particular topics, so menopause or dealing with new motherhood or dealing with parental care, whatever it might be. We're really building that library. And then the mentoring system, which we are incredibly proud of. We've currently got around 170 mentees. Some people have cycled off already, so we've had a lot more through the scheme. And we have 90 mentors available for those mentees. And again, it's about giving them different perspectives. So many people will have mentors within their own organisation, but actually this is trying to get across the sector, mentoring and different perspectives and getting somebody you can really talk to. So we're always looking for new mentors and really, really encouraging members to sign up for menteeship. It's one of my proudest things actually, when you see your mentees go off and do amazing things. We also have, I'm going to finish this in a minute. We also have associate scheme, which is some key businesses that we work with and we vet before we sort of support them. But they're relatively small businesses, but very focused on things like coaching and individual support. They are paid services, but what we're trying to do is find very women-specific support for women that you can tap into as well. And we launched that last year and it's growing quite quickly. And all of that is dependent on our partners. Because our partners fund everything we do, and we have fantastic range of partners. I love this slide now because it gets busier and busier, and poor old Helen has to fit the next logo in. If your logo is not on this slide, please can I encourage you to go back and make sure that it becomes on this slide. Everything we do is funded by our partners, and we really, really value the support that our partners give us, but everything, we've got some great plans for expansion, and that is dependent on them too. Just a quick one, what's coming up? On International Women's Day, there's a lot going on, and there's lots of speaking going on as well. We run I Am Remarkable workshops. Has anybody been on one of the I Am Remarkable workshops? If you haven't yet, a couple of hands. It's really, really a fantastic, intense workshop, which makes it's all about building your confidence in yourself. Sadly, the one on the 8th is fully booked, but we run them through the year, so there will be lots of opportunities to join in with that. 11th of April, I'm really excited about. We've just closed our survey. We've had over 400 responses to it. So we've got some really good data, and I've seen the first cut of it, and there are some really strong messages coming out through that. So we're going to use that event very much as a sort of launch pad for the results of the survey, and hope to get some real response from it. So we're inviting media, and we really want to get as many people engaged as we possibly can. So that's the next event to sign up for. It's on the website. We've got an executive dinner talking about unconscious bias and the importance of allyship in April as well. Then we've got One for All, which is our online platform for psychological safety. So again, a really important one to plug into. And then hopefully everybody's heard of Women in Utility Awards, which are on the 27th of June. I'm delighted to say that it's fully sold out in terms of the partnership opportunities, but also actually the nominations are flying in. But if you haven't nominated, if you haven't looked at it, please do, because it's a real opportunity to celebrate women in this sector. So there's a lot going on. I've talked about mentoring, I've talked about podcasts. Everything we do is accessible via our website. So if you haven't looked at our website, please do. That's where you register for events, which you must have done to get here today, but also access to the mentoring scheme, to the podcast, everything goes through there. And please make sure you sign up on the website. Historically, we just went through LinkedIn followers, but actually it enables us to really professionalise the organisation and make sure we're helping target and make sure you know what's going on. So if you haven't signed up, please do. It's not painful, it's free for all women and men. We're not exclusive at all. So that's all about one. Today's event is all about the balance of power and how the election impacting energy. And I think yesterday's budget was just a sort of a sweetener for today's conversation as well. I'm delighted to be joined by an expert panel. So we've got Kat Gay, who's EMR Change Manager for Elexon, so very much in the detail and trying to make things happen. Rachel Hayes, who's an Associate Director at Regen, who's also got some stories of having worked in government as well, so I think real great perspective and influence there. And then Kate Mulvany, who's Principal Consultant at Cornwall, who's got a very broad perspective on things. So hopefully they're going to stimulate some really good ideas, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A and get everybody's input as we go. We thought we'd start off with some Slido questions to get your views, and it was all expected to be really slick and everything. Not quite as slick as we hoped, but that's not a problem, because you put your answers in, and I've got them here, so I will talk about them. What we wanted to do here was just sort of get a flavour in the room of actually how important is this. And the first question, so which of the major parties do you believe has the most realistic vision for delivering net zero in 2050? This is really quite depressing. Conservative 10%, Labour 31%, SNP 0%, Liberal 7%, none 52%. So half of us in this room don't think that any of the parties have a realistic vision. That's, I don't know if it's surprising, shocking, depressing, one of those. The next question we asked you, do you believe that a change in government will accelerate the transition to net zero? Well, this is an interesting one. Yes, 43%. No, 46%. That's a bit more balanced. Don't know, 11%. Which ends up to more to 100, so I'm not quite sure how that works. But more of an even split. And then, how significant do you believe different climate change policies will be in influencing the election? So actually, how important is that to the electorate? Very significant, 14%. Significant, 32%. Little significance, 43%. And irrelevant, 11%. So again, I don't think there's a huge amount of optimism in this room sat here as we start this session, and we'll make sure that those statistics are shared. Building on that, we just wanted to share some of the DESNES research as well, in terms of what their research is showing, and in that landscape, the data says over 80% of people are concerned about climate change. So it's not that it's an irrelevant piece. 80%, more than 80% are very concerned or fairly concerned. And most, I think, are very realistic about actually there's likely to be an increase as a result in costs as a result of that transition. Short term more than the longer term, and hopefully the longer term is where we're all heading for. So it's not that people aren't sort of cognizant of it's an expensive transition. And this is probably the most depressing one, isn't it? But it's sort of tallies with what we've said in this room. So less than 20% of people are confident that the UK will achieve net zero by 2050. So we've got a big hockey stick to climb, and our starting position for today, if you can agree or disagree or change our views, is there isn't a huge amount of confidence, both in terms of are we going to achieve it, but also in the different political agendas. And on that, I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to introduce Kat, who's going to give her perspectives, and then we'll go to Rachel and Kate, and then we'll open up for Q&A. So, Kat, thank you.
Hi, so I'm Kat Gay. I'm the head of delivery because I literally last week got a new job role. And really, I've been in the industry for about sort of 20 odd years. And as you go through it all, should move back. As you go through it all, it doesn't matter where you sit within the industry, change is exceptionally slow. And that's hardly surprising. We've got about 466 government departments and agents. And each of those government departments and agents have got their own different change processes. They're following their own different policies. And they're all being led by whoever is at the top and their own personal opinions. Now, what we've seen over the last few years is a lot of legislative changes coming through, mainly around, obviously, the push towards sort of net zero and how we achieve that. But those individual policies are changing dependent on who you speak to. They also change depending on which government department you're talking to at the time. And that makes things exceptionally difficult to figure out exactly what the strategy is, how we're going to get there, especially. Now, what we see is a lot of people get very, very frustrated with the amount of change that we need to achieve. At the moment, we've got market-wide half-hourly, we've got capacity market coming in with new changes there, we've got contracts for difference. And most recently, we've got REMA, the review of the energy market arrangements, coming through as well, trying to change everything again. And when we talk about bureaucracy and how that can stifle change, I think the biggest, I've got sort of 3 examples of this. So back in 2014 now, we had the capacity market come in. And ostensibly to make sure that we had a capacity on the grid in case everything went wrong, basically. It was meant to be there as an insurance policy. It was very heavily focused on making sure that we had enough generation, enough supply to the market. People then came along with their own, Department of what is now Department of Business and Trade, would have come along and said, well, actually, we can't just do it around generation. We need to have a look at controlling people's demand as well. So then we saw DSR coming in, which is demand side response. What that actually meant was you had a completely different technology coming in from a different policy side into an established set of rules, or what was sort of established at the time, clashing. And in 2019, the entire capacity market came to a standstill. And that was because the EU decided that the state aid requirements weren't being met by the fact that we had this clash between the DSRs and the generation side of things. Now, that took nearly an entire year to resolve because it was going through not just the grassroots changes, it was going through the contract changes, and then it was also going through policy changes at the UK government level, and then it was going back up to the EU. because it came to basically state aid requirements there. And we are still dealing today, literally today, I've got people working on user stories and agile ways of working and different vendors as well to try and bring all of those changes back together so that we can actually make things like DSR, demand-side response, work across the settlement system so that we can pay capacity providers, those DSRs, the right amounts of money. Exceptionally difficult. It's taken a very long time. That's 2014 to 2025 now, and we are still working through those original changes. Now, that's a huge amount of time to do that. Now, what we have seen, though, is when bureaucracy works really well and can work quickly, and it gets shortcutted. So when we have shortcuts in bureaucracy, I think the easiest example for that is probably what happened with COVID-19. So when COVID came in, obviously huge strategies were put in place very, very quickly. We had a very set of rules. This is what we need to do. This is when we need to do it by, and everybody needs to do it. It was very clear everybody was working to the same set of rules, the same change had to be achieved. Now, that was great, but it was also linked quite heavily with the fact that we had one government department really looking after the whole thing, and we had the scientists coming in, the people who know, the knowledge was there to actually advise in the right ways, and everything got done, and we've come out of it, which is great. But we've also seen now that we have the COVID-19 inquiries coming through, and we're seeing that actually that bureaucracy getting shortcutted has now meant an entire review, and we've got people really looking into the legal aspects of some of those fast-tracked contracts that went through that came straight out of government. There is a balance there to hit. And that's the stuff that we knew at the time. It was the right decision to be made at the right time, and it was done quickly. Then we've got decisions that are being made by exceptional government departments which aren't talking to each other. A key example of that is probably the gas energy crisis that we've just come through. So we had trading policies which had nothing to do with energy being made to put sanctions on our trading with Russia. Now, what that actually meant was Russia got annoyed and turned down our gas supply by about 80%. That, in turn, increased energy supply prices by about 10 times their previous amounts. And that had a massive impact. Now, that's government departments not talking to each other and not having all of the right information together at the right time. But they were making the right decisions at the right time because illegal war in Ukraine, we need to make sure that we are having those sort of sanctions in there and in place. So what you can see is actually policy decisions and bureaucracy and the level of change is something which can be heavily stifling to making change quickly. And that's just 3 examples. And at the moment, we're obviously driving towards a net zero. And in order to do that, we need to have more energy, green energy connected to the grid. Now, what that actually means is that not only do we need to incentivise the green energy coming on, we actually need to change our policies for that, which means changing the way the capacity market works, which means going from a sort of technology neutral policy to a very technology-focused auction dynamic there, which completely changes the way the capacity market was meant to work. Is it the right thing? Probably, because we had DSR coming in sideways and it shut down the capacity market. So it does need a rethink. But then, on the flip side of things, you bring in extra technology, extra like battery storage, hydrogen, smart metering and all of that. What that actually means is that we need more connections to the grid. Now, for electrification of just the London network, we need about £1 billion worth of extra investment between now and 2030 to rework the national grid just within the London boundaries, just to get the number of connections in there to bring in all of the DSR that we want in there, to bring in all of the rest of the battery storage that we want in there, and all of the green technology, which we all want, but nobody really wants to pay for. And that's when policy and bureaucracy start stepping in, because they need to figure out how to pay for it, they need to figure out how to get that in there. So you've got huge amounts of government policy coming through from the top, to 466 different agents and settlement bodies and other government departments coming through, and all of them have to figure out how to work together and bring that through. Now, if you want green technology and you want green connections, you also then need to talk about the devolved government powers in each of your individual GSP groups where you live, basically. And to put that in context, it takes about 2 years to get planning permission to build an extension on your house. And we've got to try and re-electrify the entire national grid. It's going to take a very long time, but what you can see from the level of bureaucracy is not a dirty word. People think it is because they immediately assume that bureaucracy is a massive blocker to change. It's not, it's checks and balances. The only way that you can really simplify bureaucracy is making sure that we all have exactly the same thing that we need to work to, and everybody's actually talking together and have roughly the same change processes. Everyone needs to work backwards from the end and start looking at how they actually get there at that point. I think about that from obviously a very change manager perspective, but that's literally the only way I can think of actually simplifying bureaucracy. And if you have a change of government, if you have a change of policy, you end up changing the goalposts for that. And we've seen, obviously, a couple of weeks ago, obviously Labour took away its 28 million or 28 billion pounds of green technology investment because they don't know how to pay for it. And a lot of that is because it's going to take so long. They don't have the right information at the right time. We need to make sure that in order for the government to make the right decisions and for that to actually come back through, we've got that overarching knowledge base who are actually influencing in the right time, the right areas, and everybody actually knows how to get there. So bureaucracy is not the issue, it's actually knowledge and collaboration, which I don't think really, looking forward to some of the things that we've got there, nobody really knows how to do, and I think there is quite a significant unsurety around that, which then means that you don't have enough investment because there's no surety there.
Great, thank you. So bureaucracy and change. In my case, there are other roles in the group. Rachel, do you want to give your perspective?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I'm from Regen, Rachel Hayes, Associate Director. So I think if you think of the prize, an efficient, clean, affordable energy system that harnesses our abundant renewable energy power is a win for any government. So Regen, as Joe alluded to, we're not a political organisation. We haven't kind of pinned we're not pinned to any colours specifically. But we are, this is a thing we're looking at on a regular basis. I'm fascinated by the politics. I haven't necessarily, my views aren't probably really coherent because there's so much going on in my brain, but we are looking at what they're saying, and maybe I'll just reflect some of that back to you. So I think my first example is I did a 9-month stint in the COP unit, and that was when Boris Johnson was our Prime Minister, after all the changes. I'm sure you can remember that. And so first off, from a real personal perspective, it was fascinating to see someone's personal leadership in that space. Like he clearly came in, he had an agenda, a personal agenda, and he wanted to push things through, and he definitely did that. There might not have been huge amounts of substance to what he was pushing through, but it was fascinating to see that somebody with a kind of personal remit who had the power and the position was able to just get things through. We had the 10-point plan and the energy security strategy, and there's huge amounts of policies that came out of government in that time, and that was really helpful, both in terms of our domestic leadership and to kind of align the private sector behind a particular goal, and also our international leadership. And I think that we really can't underestimate the UK's position in terms of international leadership. This is an international race. We've seen the impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act in America. We've seen, how quickly people can move in China in terms of deploying, taking, is that the right word? Doing, actually the manufacturing, the factories, the kind of the build out, the supply chain we are all competing, and our investors, there's only a certain number of investors, and our investors are wooed by America and they're wooed by China, and they're leaving the UK. I think, I can't remember where we are now, but we were something like number 28 on the list or something. Kate, you might know actually where we are now, but we're not as high on the list as we were, and so and that's become abundantly clear with Rishi in power, where he has made some rollbacks. He's sending a very different signal. He's issued kind of some of those backpedaling statements. And so we can see the impact, I guess, of the politics on the policies that Kat was talking about. So if we have a party with a clean power mission, the green growth engine, the kind of the industrial strategy underpinned by growth, with potentially a 28 billion budget, which has disappeared quite quickly. What does that look like? So that's sending a clear message to investors. And so I think I'm more optimistic than many of you in the room, I guess, in terms of the Slido polling. Like, I do believe that if we have those kind of targets, and the certainty, I believe the private sector will deliver. We're at 48% renewables now, and I'm optimistic that if we continue with a clear vision, then the private sector and the investors will come, and will stay, most importantly right now. But as Kat alluded to in quite a lot of detail, this is really bloody hard. Like, the energy system is so complex, and the decisions that are made in terms of, the capacity market changes and things, those ramifications, they play on for years. And so the idea of making decisions really carefully, and the underpinning example that Kat talked about in terms of REMA, so we're Regen, we're kind of pushing for tinkering around the edges. We're not pushing for fundamental reform. We don't want to put investors off. We don't feel like now is the right time to be shaking the market up substantially. And that's because those decisions, they really do play out for years, and they can be quite challenging. So I guess in terms of the skills, the capacity, the capital, the regulation, all those things need thinking about carefully. And a different government does give us a different vibe. So examples where Regen's got into quite a lot of the detail are around grid and around planning. I don't think there's ever a conversation I have with the sector which doesn't talk about one of those two things. So in terms of grid, both parties have made really strong commitments. They've got strong ambition. Ministers are saying it's important. I guess if we end up with a Labour government, and the polling's suggesting currently that we might, it's much more of a kind of active state, much more interventionist, much more kind of vaccine task force kind of rollout, where, it's another layer in, it's kind of getting your hands dirty. A Conservative government is very much kind of, this is the policy, this is the framework, now private sector, you crack on and deliver. So the two parties definitely have a different approach, but I think we can fundamentally say that both of them now realise that grid is a really important issue, and it's kind of top of agenda. And we wrote to the minister at the end of 2022 saying, 15-year delays are a bit of a concern, and could we please do something to fix that? My son, he's 6 now. He'll be celebrating his 21st birthday before half of the development sector get their grid connection dates, which is slightly terrifying. And then planning, Kat mentioned it takes 2 years to get an extension on your house, but there's a lot of planning. We've got the planning for actually getting renewables projects and storage projects built. We've also got the planning and the transmission lines, and the huge discussions around kind of community benefit and how we build out those transmission lines. And so the planning for the pipes and wires, as well as the planning for the projects themselves. The politics there get much more challenging, I think. The Labour's kind of leaned in to be the builders, not the blockers. Potentially it's politically easier for the Conservatives than it is for Labour. I don't know. These are like personal opinions kind of creeping out. So, but do they really understand what's needed to get that built? I think with Labour, the teams are really resource constrained. They've got some really knotty issues to kind of get into at the moment, and so the likes of Regen and many other organisations in the sector are really kind of there's a lot of thought leadership papers appearing this year, really helping people kind of understand the detail of the challenges that we're facing. We are seeing the kind of impact of political. Ed Miliband coming out last week and saying, the first thing he's going to do is remove the ban on onshore wind. We updated our graphic last week, which said, on the planning, nice picture of the UK, and there was lots of dots saying lots of wind farm applications. We're now to no dots, no wind farm applications. So, it has completely halted the sector, that and that was down to a few swing seats in a few areas. And so the politics really can go against public opinion and really impact the build out of our cheapest technology. So it's slightly challenging. The other thing that we're seeing from Labour is the kind of increased ambition, a 2030 target rather than 2035 target. We did a piece of work kind of modelling what it looks like a day in the life of a 2035 net zero power system, which is really interesting to kind of combat some of the myths around what happens when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. And, it is possible. So what we're working towards is possible. But I think the message for both the 2035 and the 2030 target is that operability of the system as we go beyond 48% renewables is key. And I think that's going to become a bigger and bigger challenge that we're seeing. We're also seeing that Labour may be more interested in striking more deals behind the scenes. So in terms of this policy certainty in this area, we want to see more jobs, we want to see more UK manufacturing, we want to see more supply chain, local content. So there are trade-offs happening behind, and important trade-offs. Like there isn't necessarily huge amounts of jobs in owning or kind of operating a wind farm, but there's loads of jobs in the supply chain element, getting it built, getting it off the ground. So I think that some of those trade-offs and what we want to see in the UK and where the jobs are really important. And I think I think it gets challenging. So once you move into heat, once you start doing things to real people's homes, and you start messing around with the heating system and it impacts you. It makes dust in your living room, and that's annoying. I did a heat pump a couple of years ago, and it's very annoying, a ground source one. And so once you start, interfering in people's homes and suggesting what they do and what they don't do, and interfering in those personal decisions, I think for any political party it starts to get really challenging, and I don't think anyone's nailed that yet, and I just think that's tricky. And in terms of the success stories, I think offshore wind has been a fantastic success story for the UK, both in terms of our deployment of offshore wind, in terms of how that helps with energy security, in terms of how the supply chain and the kind of sector has really worked with government hand in hand. It's been a real partnership approach. And I think that we've seen that kind of build out, and then we've seen that kind of international leadership globally. And that investor confidence and that kind of certainty is really bringing the price down. Maybe the last auctions were maybe that wasn't quite as aligned as it could be, but broadly it's pretty well aligned. And renewables is really competitively priced now. I think I'm going to stop there. Actually, there's quite a bit of ground I've covered. So
fantastic. So building on to the delivery and change, please. We've got the importance of investors, leadership, policy. So building on that, and I'm now going to hand over to Kate to continue and give some more.
Excellent. So I'm Kate Mulvany. I am a principal consultant at Cornwall Insight. I know that when I introduce myself as a consultant, there are often a lot of blank faces, so I'm just going to briefly explain what that actually means. Certainly before I became a consultant or worked closely with them, it was a bit of a mysterious black box, not always with good connotations. Sometimes after you've worked with consultants, you still think it's a mysterious black box, but hopefully not. So Cornwall Insight are independent energy experts. Our goal is helping net zero happen. We are absolutely agnostic on the method of how we get there. So we work with networks, suppliers, regulators, governments, MPs. We work with investors an awful lot. And increasingly in recent years, we've been working with large energy users. So metalworks, local authorities, people who've got really, really big budgets, who have to make very important decisions around millions or even billions of pounds over a lifetime of an asset. And also they've got very stringent net zero targets. So my job as a consultant is to use all the very, very smart people's analysis. All of the analysts and researchers I work with, they look backwards and they also forecast ahead. And I take this vast lake of data and hopefully make it useful for whoever our customers are. So increasingly, when we're working in these spaces with people who haven't got a clue who Cornwall Insight are, I will cut to the chase and describe myself as an energy geek. And I work in a company of proud energy geeks. Now, this is the first time I have ever been able to professionally say I am a political geek as well. And normally at this point in my introduction, if I'm talking about energy, I give a few credentials. I talk about my 2 decades working in energy, who I've worked for, with which policy, etc. So I'm going to do the same again, but for politics. So starting with when I was at school, I had a Saturday job. I worked in a bakery. I earned a princely £1.80 an hour. And I spent that money voluntarily on Private Eye magazine. I watched every general election since 1992 live, and then I went back and I watched every general election from 1955 onwards for fun. This is not my job. This is just what I do for fun. But it was, I'm so glad I did it, and I really recommend it. I mean, yeah, bear with me. But the reason I got so much out of that was to see the constancy of people's concerns. I think, the past is a foreign country. We think of people in, time periods prior to ours as being almost aliens, as wanting different things. And the constancy of what people talk about and care about, whether it's vox pops, whether it's person in the street interviews, whether it's policymakers, academics, it is the same topics that come up time and time again. Now, my personal view is that people only change their vote for 2 reasons. And I'm going to frame them slightly weirdly. If you're not a parent, bear with me, I will explain. So the first reason people will vote or not vote for a party is, will this make my child more likely to have a good job? Now, you might not have kids, or you might have kids and actually don't care if they've got a good job. I don't know. I mean, I don't know your life. But it's that mildly altruistic, outward, forward-looking view. So it's not what's the economy like in terms of graphs and charts. It's, will people I know and care about who are real to me have access to economic opportunities and assurity? So will this party make my children's ability to get a good job easier? And then I think the second reason people will vote for a particular party is, will this party make it more likely that my child has to go to war? Now, it's a variation on that. Again, it might not be fully war, it might not be, again, my child, but is this path more likely to make us closer to insecurity? Is it going to make me fearful? And ultimately, is it going to make it more likely that people I care about are going to be physically harmed? So those are the 2 things that I genuinely think make people put an X in a particular box. Now, everything else that they talk about and people say they care about, of course they care about it. People care about law and order. People care about nutrition in schools. People care about education. And absolutely people care about energy. But they do up to the point where maybe it interferes with one of those 2 other things. So they're not always mutually exclusive. Sometimes better energy security absolutely goes hand in hand with, it's less likely my children are going to go to war. There is also a pathway where maybe better energy security could require a sacrifice of some kind. And I am not as interested in that as I am that more global, that total view. So people are sincere when they talk about their concern about energy. But I think one of the mistakes that we often make as well is we imagine this is all very modern concerns and that people are uniquely interested in energy or climate change or any part of the trilemma. And I don't think that's true. In the 50s, if you go back, absolutely dominated by questions of nationalisation. And I know a lot of industry was nationalised, but energy, power, nuclear, all of it was incredibly central to the entire Labour political manifesto. You then move on, look in the 70s. In 1974, there were 2 general elections, both of them agonising, far more miserable than anything we've got today. And they were both, not exclusively, but energy and the energy crisis played a huge part in that. 79, you're moving into the winter of discontent. In the 1980s, you've got privatisation and you've got miners' strikes. I mean, these are the twin elements of a very divisive political period. I think people think that there's an unusual amount of tension nowadays between people of different political views. I can tell you now, whether you're voting on climate change, your child is not going to be bullied in the community because of it. Whereas if you go back, there are still people in, mining communities, ex-mining communities, who whenever they show their face in public, someone will go, their dad was a scab. Unbelievable length of memory because of the strength of feeling. Now, again, it's not about energy, maybe as we always think about it, but energy is at the heart of so many other policies. Energy is the stuff of economies. Energy is what we go to war over. Energy is, the stuff of life. In 1997, the New Labour manifesto included under its energy policy an appetite to build out renewable energy. The 2010s, if you look at the energy trilemma, if you look at whether it's David Cameron's leadership or subsequent prime ministers, there's been an awful lot of prominence in terms of talk, even if absolutely not necessarily specific policy delivery. But there's been a real prominence given to a recognition around what renewable energy can achieve. And yet we are still here today where there is uncertainty, and that uncertainty directly impacts our ability as a country to achieve net zero. We touched on it a little, but one of the most frustrating parts, I think, for the last year has been the conversation around affordability, and particularly how it relates to investors and investor returns. I don't know about you and your lives, but I know that this last couple of years is the first time in my life that my friends and family have wanted to talk to me about my job. And bless them, they still sometimes regret it when they bring it up. But they really do want to know, what's going on. They want to understand more. They're really, really open to that. And of course, politicians quite rightly are responding to a genuine cost of living crisis. This isn't I'm incrementally worse off, but I can't really feel it. I doubt anyone in this room hasn't felt that change. And, people we know, people in our communities are experiencing absolute hardships. People are sitting in the cold and the dark. Kids are going to school hungry, in unwashed clothes because things that perhaps have been taken for granted in previous generations, they aren't currently accessible to some of those families. This is a genuine crisis. It isn't hyperbole. But then when we talk about what's going to deliver long-term value for people, what's going to lower bills in that longer term, it's a really, really hard conversation to have. Now, it's not to say that urgent political intervention doesn't need to happen in the near term. It absolutely does. People are struggling. There's been lots of talk of things like social tariffs. We really hope that the government engages with that rapidly and again identifies ways of helping those most in need. But longer term, although things like, say, for example, a windfall tax, there can be near-term revenue for the exchequer. And again, not denying the importance of money flowing in through tax or levies to be able to fund different areas as well. But when you're looking at billions or even trillions of pounds worth of investment, and you know that all of those investors are watching what you were doing politically, they're saying, actually, this deal that we agreed a few years ago around what an acceptable rate of return on our investment was, you're changing the rules halfway through. That's something that investors notice. They understand how stable a regulatory environment is. If the more stable it is, the lower the premium for their risk will be. The less stable it's perceived to be, the more expensive that loan will be upfront, because they'll want to make sure they get the expected return on their investment. So the most simple way I can put it is there is always a consequence and a cost for things like windfall taxes that is paid for by the ultimate bill payer. Now, sometimes that trade-off will be worth it, and sometimes that trade-off might not be worth it. But we really struggle to have that honest conversation as part of our political discourse. It's something that, it feels good for a politician to be able to stand up there and go, yeah, I'm going after those excessive windfall revenues. And again, not saying that's right or wrong, but the consequence of that is ultimately borne by bill payers, taxpayers. So we have to make sure that whenever these levers are pulled, that there's a real appreciation that there is a consequence, particularly when we are, as a country, we are competing on an international stage for investment. That money, from a pension fund, that could go to any country in the world. It could go to a country that's further behind than we are in terms of the decarbonisation agenda. So, that money could do more. It could save more carbon than it could here maybe in the UK, where we're already about halfway through our decarbonisation programme. There are lots of reasons why it is challenging to attract investment in this environment. There are lots of reasons why it's a great thing to attract investment, including ultimately helping those longer term bills. So when we tinker with that, when there's policy uncertainty, when there's retrospective clawbacks, windfall taxes, what have you, we have to be really, really honest that sometimes that's going to be the right choice, but sometimes there will be a consequence for all of us in the future when maybe we have to pay a bit more on our bills as a result. So I think that short-term, absolutely, intervention is still needed for those people who are most in need, and we haven't cracked that, even with falling energy bills. Longer term, we can't take our eye off the ball about what value for money means, even in the context of the energy transition. And I really hope that whichever political party leads after the next election starts to have and trust that the electorate will accept some of these harder to swallow pills, and that ultimately this is going to get us where we need to go. So, thanks.
Great, thank you, Kate. I didn't know you. I'm not convinced I'm going to go and watch all the elections.
Which ones the best ones are?
Good for an insomnia or something. Really powerful messages, and actually I think Kate really pulled out at the end the importance of human sentiment and actually what makes people do things and what makes people make decisions. And it's one of my personal bugbears in this industry is that we nearly always undervalue human aspects as opposed to the economic or the political or whatever. Actually, it's what makes people do things and what makes people think things. That's just my personal bias coming out there. So we've got lots of ideas that we've talked about here from the macro in terms of what does make people vote for parties, and actually energy is always relevant, and our pessimism might or might not be unfounded because there's lots of other things. We've got sort of leadership, piece and policy in the middle, and then actually the delivery. How do you actually turn from an idea into delivery? So lots and lots of ideas have been thrown at you, and I've got lots of questions, but I'm going to open it up to the floor, both for questions, but also if you've got a particular point you want to make, having heard some of that from a particular perspective, really welcome those as well. It's conversation rather than a sort of a them and us. Anybody got one stop?
No pressure then. So I'm Sarah Vaughan, I'm the chair of Elexon, and I also sit on the board of the North Sea Transition Authority. And I've been in the industry for many, many years. So I think I've seen quite a lot of this. And I remember, I mean, we've had Rishi Sunak recently. I remember David Cameron and Let's Cut the Green Crap as well. And I remember actually sitting in rooms talking to the Cabinet Secretary about what they were intending to do and what a really bad idea it was. And I think since then, we have seen many consultants and other advisory bodies show just what a bad idea that was, because the additional cost it's brought into the industry through reducing the amount of insulation. Coming back to the question, though, I think part of the problem behind all of this is short-termism. And that short-termism comes from the fact that we sit in either previously fixed-term parliament cycles or parliamentary cycles where it's all dependent on the Prime Minister. And there is a really important body that I don't think got mentioned very much in what you were talking about, which was the media. And what the media manages to do is to effectively create the debate and influences people, probably not the people in this room because we're better informed, but the man in the street. The man in the street probably doesn't understand what net zero means, truly. But they do understand when they talk about the massive profits that BP or Shell or Centrica or whoever it happens to be. So I guess my question to you would be, how do you think we get over that short-termism in energy. One of the things that I've been reading recently is around, and in fact Chris Skidmore talked about it and you, Kirk, talked about it. Do we have an office for delivery of net zero? Does it sit at the same level as the Treasury so that you have that continuity? There are ideas out there, but I'd be really interested to hear views from all of you on that. And I should have said up front, I'm sorry. Thank you. Fabulous presentations, really interesting. And I loved the way that you covered the different elements of it. It was great. Thank you.
Who's going to take it first?
Kit can't hold back. No, sorry, this is going to be like this the whole time. I've got a million opinions, and I'm so sorry you have to hear all of them. Yes, so I think it's interesting on the media. So if any of you have heard of Cornwall Insight, it's either probably because you get some of our products as a company or you've seen us in the news, and a lot of that is down to Verity, who I'm going to make really embarrassed. Yeah, she's our press officer and she's basically a wizard. I describe us as being like the corporate equivalent of three dogs in a trench coat. We are like a relatively small organisation punching way above our weight. And the reason for that, other than obviously the beautifully crafted comms strategy, is because people are crying out for an explanation. And I think even in the media, we get called into all kinds of, weird arenas. I've been on the BBC. What is this about? What is my career? But there is a real hunger for genuine understanding, and I'm not naive. I understand that there is, as much as we talk about all these other things being important at a general election, the rest of the time we do really care about other things. We care about the fact that people care that they don't want what they think was a gross factory being built down the road from them. If they've got a job already, or if they don't have a job, they really want that factory built. There's all these micro issues that people really care about. But there's a limited amount of time in the media, and people aren't looking for a treatise every day on some new, immensely complicated environment. I've been working in energy for 2 decades. There's so much I still learn every single week. So if this is where I am, and people have got busy lives, in an attention economy, it is not reasonable for us to ask them to stop their lives, spend less time with their families and friends to contemplate complicated ideas. They just want it sorted and fixed. So I think there is a tension there where you have a media who I do think is genuinely seeking explanations. They want to know what's coming next. They want to help their audience. That audience wants to know, but ultimately has a limited amount of hours in the day. I do think some of the well-intended messaging, and this is my very, very personal view, but some well-intended messaging over the last 10 years has actually caused some damage. So every time someone has stood up and said, renewable energy is 9 times cheaper than fossil fuels. The end. No further questions. And not taking it for... There's an amazing economic case about renewable energy, but it is not that it is 9 times cheaper. If that were true, without taking into account systems costs, balancing costs, storage, etc., of course it sounds corrupt if you're a member of the public and you hear this message that there's a magic source of electricity that is 9 times cheaper than the traditional method, and it's only vested interests is the reason we're carrying on. So I think we've got to take those lessons, as I say, very well intended, trying to draw attention to new ways, the urgency of the energy transition, take lessons from where we've been, the things we've tried to communicate to people, and where we've maybe left some idea voids that may or may not be filled with increasingly conspiracy-minded people. And then we can craft those messages. And together, I think it's really important that we're transparent. I think it's important that we don't hide the bad news. I think it is not helpful when people try and claim the energy transition is nothing but upside, because the transition phase is going to feel at best quite neutral, I think, for most bill payers. It's going to get us to a point where things are more affordable. But we have to trust that the audience, that voters, that bill payers, whether it's domestic customers, non-domestic customers, we have to be honest with them that this isn't next week or next year that bills are suddenly going to drop through the floor, that the energy transition will have benefits for them and their families and their communities. Some of those will be in the longer term. Some of them will be revealed more quickly, and that is still better than the alternative. So I think wherever we are in the energy industry, whether we're talking to the media, whether we're talking to our friends and family, whether we're talking with our customers or stakeholders, don't hide the bad news for fear that they will refuse everything. If we secrete all of that away, it will make things harder and more difficult in the long run. And trust that they are interested. Absolutely respect the fact that they're time poor. So, you know, be brief, be consistent, but do be open. That's my suggestion.
Rachel, you were in COP26. That's not short term.
No, that's not short-termism. I think Kate's point earlier about friends and family wanting to talk to us about energy for the first time ever is really important, and we are seeing energy in the news much more often, and that's a really positive thing. And I think broadly that's what we are seeing is fairly accurate reporting in some cases, and the likes of ECIU, the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, are doing a really powerful job in supporting that communications, and they only exist with charitable trust money currently, and so that there is a kind of question behind the business model and who supports the messaging and how it's supported. I think your point there about the short-termism of 5-year election cycles and how that is really impacting our vision for the future. I think a net zero remit by 2050, a net zero power system by 2035, I think some of those longer-term strategic goals are helpful. I think there is, all the public polling and opinion is in agreement that saving the planet and getting to net zero is a good thing. And so I think net zero shouldn't be a political football. There should be party consensus around this, and we have seen a bit of political footballing at the end of last year, which personally it was a real shame. Actually, I was really hoping that it wouldn't be one of those things that got kicked around. I quite like the idea of an office for net zero. I quite liked a lot of what Skidmore was suggesting, and it's a real shame that he's kind of chucked in the towel, because he wasn't making as much progress as he'd like to, because he had some fantastic recommendations for government. So I don't have an answer, I don't have the solution, but I quite like some of the things that have been proposed, and I definitely agree that we need to get out of that 5-year cycle, and for supply chains to, we've seen it with energy efficiency being really, that's probably the worst piece of energy policy we've ever seen. Where the supply chain, ramps up and gets ready and recruits and trains, and you build factories, and you have everything in place, and then here comes the towel. It's really challenging for industry, and I'm sure they're as frustrated by that kind of 5-year cycle. So that long-term certainty that enables people to invest in their businesses and recruit people and train them, I think, is vital.
One from the front. One roving mic.
Yes, so Frances Warburton, previously Director at Ofgem and partner at EY. I just think some of the points you made are absolutely spot on. I think just touching briefly on your points about economic and security to start with. I mean, obviously, military spending is going to have to go up. I mean, the target of the NATO is 2%, Poland's going for 6%. US 4 to 5. I mean, the fact of the matter is, back to your point about war and the risk of your children going off to war, we're going to have to spend a lot more money on defence. That's, I think, an unavoidable truth. It will create more jobs. So back to your point about secure jobs, etc. So I think more so, defence is going to compete with net zero. We have to accept that. We can't fight that fact. I also think the cost of living crisis has mean consumers are less willing and able to put their own money towards things like heat pumps and EVs. We can't fight that fact. We can't pretend the events of the last 2 years, 3 years haven't fundamentally changed the case for net zero. So it is a much harder sell to voters. And I think if you look at the polling about net zero, it is dropping. Support for net zero is falling against these other competing pressures. So I think there's 3 key challenges we need to face in the upcoming election. We'll need to address to get the commitment to proceed with net zero. One is it's expensive. Secondly, it's not necessary. It's somehow ideologically driven. It's a nice to have, not a need to have. And then finally, why is the UK continuing to be at the front of the pack? Why do we have to stay first? Why can't we drop back to mid-pack? Let's see what India and China do. That's what they do really matters. So those, to me, are the 3 barriers we've got to overcome. So starting with expensive, the CCC and others continue to show at 1% of GDP to avoid net zero is far less expensive than the 4% of GDP to deal with unmitigated extreme climate change. Now, people with the short-termism that Sarah mentioned aren't getting that message. So yes, you can save a bit of money in the next decade by not spending on net zero, but the cost of flood prevention, I'm seeing in my local park, has had to be completely re-landscaped in Wimbledon to deal with flooding, and at a very, very significant cost that everybody has seen. So I think getting that message across that this is all about short-termism, and if we don't spend a reasonable amount on net zero now, we'll be spending an awful lot more in not only our children's lifetimes, but in our lifetimes. So I think that's the first challenge, is dealing with the expensive question about it, that it's all too expensive now, we can't afford net zero. Secondly, the fact that it's not needed or ideologically driven. We are seeing greater polarization now on net zero. So if you look at the US and Canada, where I grew up, it's very polarized. If you're left wing, you support net zero. If you're to the right, absolutely not. And we really have to avoid that political polarization. And I think this is where the science and the role of the CCC and all our independent bodies, the NIC, the CCC, all these bodies, to continue to tell consumers in a trusted way, this is absolutely needed. This is the science behind it. It isn't an ideologically driven imperative. And then finally, the role of the UK in leadership position vis-a-vis the US, China, India, even Canada is way, way, way behind, and seems quite contented with that. I think there's a real case to be made of what is the role of the UK staying at the front. Could we afford to drop back a bit and do other things to support other priorities as well? I think really someone's going to have to make that decision of, are we going to push to get back higher up the list that you mentioned? EY runs the twice a year ranking of countries, and the UK is dropping further and further behind. How important is it to consumers that we stay? And should we in the near term accept some dropping back, but still in the medium to longer term to getting there? So I think these are some of the big challenges, and I think all of your presentations were great in touching on all that.
Fantastic. And just to reinforce that point, from a personal perspective on that, short-termism, one of the boards I sit on is higher education, so doing working with a lot of the universities, and we had a conversation very recently, which was like, so isn't that sort of drive for net zero, for carbon reduction still there? And the answer is yes, absolutely. But it's tomorrow's problem, because today's problem is the financial crisis today. And I think that's the same for domestic as for, so I think it just reinforces that everybody still believes in it, but it's being kicked down the road. We'll move on to another question or another comment. Anybody?
Thanks. You might regret this. I could keep going for at least an hour, I think, with all of the amazing comments we've had so far. So thank you for everyone for your contributions. So I'm Sarah Samuel. Amongst my former roles, I was head of Sustainable Energy Policy Ofgem, and I was also head of Energy at the Sustainable Development Commission. And I wanted to pick up on a number of points about sort of the short-termism, around governance, around planning, and ask the panel about what impacts you think the introduction of the NESO will have in the energy sector. So honestly, I slightly shudder at the idea of a office for net zero delivery, because I think that fragmenting the governance of the sector and the economy, it probably won't help us. And I think that really we've got a department for net zero, and surely they should fulfil the role of an office for net zero. And I also think that the NESO is being dealt a bit of a short straw at the moment. I honestly slightly feel like they're being ganged up on by Ofgem and government, and it's like, these are things that it's too difficult for us to do, so we've created this new body and off you go and do them. And I think they've been given a really difficult job and have created further fragmentation and potentially reduced the leadership in the energy sector and in net zero delivery at a time when actually we need more leadership and clearer sense of direction. So I'd love to hear from the panel around the role of that and how they think that impacts the sector.
Because I disagree. And the reason I disagree is I think that, yes, NESO has come along, and to be fair, it's a good scapegoat. DESNZ haven't been able to fully be efficient in what it was setting out to do. And obviously we see a huge amount of dichotomy between that and the fact that it got split out from Department of Business and Trade. Department of Business and Trade is obviously going in there and saying we want more jobs, we want to increase investment, and we've seen already things coming in. I went to a supplier event last week, and one of the key things that were coming out of that was a supplier saying, we don't want more levies, stop giving us all of these levies to support all of these things. In particular, they were looking at energy intensive industries, and everyone goes, oh, energy intensive industries, and giving them basically their supplier charges back for some of them. Now that to them goes, well, brilliant, cool, we're getting investment into more jobs, because obviously British Steel have had to let go a huge amount of people because it's an energy intensive industry. And they've gone with, we'll give them some money back. They'll come back into the UK because But that's only a very small part. And then you've got Department of Business and Trade saying more jobs, we want more investment, and then DESNA is basically coming in and saying, well, actually, we need more investment over here as well. They're butting up against each other. So NESO is meant to come in and actually try and give that overarching, bring them all together. What it's actually doing is becoming that scapegoat. I think if you actually gave them enough power, going back to Sarah's point, if we actually put them back up to the level of, say, Treasury, working at that level, and actually coming in separate to government and actually saying, this is what you need to do, this is how you need to do it. Now, REMA has taken in a huge amount of brain and knowledge from Elexon, Ofgem, and other areas of the industry. It's going some way towards making those changes. Has it gone far enough? I'm not entirely sure. I would say that actually I would disagree with it tinkering. Tinkering gives you that surety, but does it go far enough into actually getting us to where we need to be in the long term? Probably not. NESO has the opportunity to do that. It's just, I don't think it's been given enough power to do it. It's basically, it is being scapegoated. It's come in short term, quick, get those guys in. They'll take the fall. We'll carry on. Sorry, that was quite a...
So I think that's a great question. One of my first jobs when I went into the COP unit, it was in the March and just after the Canby Fields announcement, and it was kind of like, oh God, we're running COP, we're in a position of international leadership. How the hell has this thing from this other department come out? And that's really undermining everything. And so I was in quite a nice position where I got to see every policy that was going out of government, and there was a bit of a kind of COP test that was applied to everything and that alignment. But what that did really highlight to me is that there isn't that kind of cross-department alignment in the way that there should be, and not always does one hand know what the other hand is doing, and obviously with such a big kind of machine, it's tricky to do that. On the NESO point, I think they do need more. I think it's brilliant that it's been set up. I think they need more power. They have some fantastic women there. So Claire Dichter, Kate O'Neill. Like I have absolute faith that they are the right people in the right jobs, and so I think if anyone is going to kind of get there, then personally I'm vested in them being successful.
I have a slightly different view on these. So, firstly, I absolutely love people who work at the ESO, the various groups. They are so smart. They are so smart, and they do such a good job already. But they do such a good job with their current tasks, which is solve for safety, solve for reliability. And it's not that they're not otherwise effective organisations, but NESO is create and solve for a brand new, ultra-efficient, ultra-dynamic market. Like, where is the commerciality coming from? I don't even think it's about remit. And at the moment, if they had an even bigger remit, I would be terrified. Because if we look at, it's not through a lack of will or smarts, but if we look at, say, for example, the balancing mechanism, trying to get the merit order to recognise the flexibility of battery storage as though it's some brand new technology that no one's ever heard of before. And a lot of that wasn't the market incentives, it wasn't the price signals, it was the human being in a control room having to overcome their concern around reliability and from this really great place, wanting to do a very high quality job. It's taken years to get us to where we are now, which isn't where we need to be. That is one tiny facet of the market that is still only a percentage of a way towards where it needs to be. And overnight, we're asking those same organisations to suddenly come up with better solutions for the whole market in a complicated way. Ultimately having an influence on who winners are. I don't think there is the skills and experience there right now from the donor organisations to possibly come up with better solutions. So yes, I think they are being set up to answer impossible questions. I also don't think, and again, they've done really great work so far. The proto-NESO, they've been reaching out, they're asking the right questions. They are so skilled and enthusiastic, but that experience from being able to incorporate the commerciality, I haven't yet seen that. And I really hope that I'm wrong, maybe it's going on in different rooms to where I am, but we are asking people to do something very different to what they've been asked to do before. And I think that is a years-long exercise, and we don't have years. As to, I didn't answer it earlier. nobody absolutely should not have a department for net zero, because all that will happen there is that someone will get some, new headed note paper, be delighted, and spend 2 years designing this perfect hypothetical, system outside of everything else. It is something that every single department has to think about. It will allow everyone else to to shuffle it off into someone else. Oh, let them deal with it. Absolutely not. It has to be everywhere. And then, finally. Yeah, totally in terms of trust, and all of the organisations the Climate Change Committee, really, really important messaging. I absolutely agree. There's an awful lot for different bodies to do. But ultimately, and I'm so sorry if people keep hearing me bring up this analogy, but I am somebody, let's say, who works in retail. Last week, I worked 50 hours. I am living in a rented flat that has damp and it is gas powered, and I will never, ever be able to afford my own home. And I know that. A mile down the road, I have somebody who owns a £1 million asset who is getting help insulating their home, having solar panels installed, maybe a tax break on an EV and a battery storage system. I'm already helping them with improving their quality of life under the net zero banner. And asking me somehow to pay more in this, for things that are quite conceptual, doesn't matter who and how much authority, which scientist says it, it will feel like something is being done to me, to my wage packet, affecting my ability to care for my children. So yes, that authoritative voice, that consistency is really important at a policy level, but it is not going to hit the sides when it comes to engaging with people that's their day-to-day experience. So, when we're thinking about make gas more expensive because then people have an incentive to move to electricity. Think about that person who has no influence over what goes into their home. Think about them first and foremost. It's not that it's a bad option, but you have to really think about how it feels and what's the message they're hearing. It's just going to be more expensive for you. They'll see the CCC as an extension of government. That is not going to help with them. Organisations like Citizens Advice have been doing amazing work, and I think the analysis they've been doing over some of the market design decisions are really accessible. But again, people are time poor; they don't want to spend their time poring over these things. So we have to think not just about the ultimate. The people maybe we would look to for steer on analysis and policy decisions. That isn't enough to engage ultimately with people whose bills are going to be affected, whose choices around how they heat their home are going to be affected. So I think, having that great, clear voice is useful, but I think it solves one aspect of the problem. And I think sometimes when we talk about it, not you, but I think sometimes when we talk about it more generally, we can almost think that that's the end goal, whereas it's just obviously a piece of the overall puzzle.
Yeah, so on the engagement piece, we had Nick Windsor speak at our planning event last week, and he's really advocating for that kind of broader public campaign on net zero to help people understand, what are the fundamentals needed to get us to net zero and what will impact them and how and why. And I do think that's really needed. And I think developers aren't making that case. A battery storage developer who wants to get planning isn't taking a step back and making a case in terms of why battery storage is important and what is its need in a net zero power system. People are just seeing that as the industrialisation of the countryside. And that backlash is coming in a couple of years' time, inevitably. Just your point on the BM, without meaning to undo what I said before, we run the electricity storage network, and we are in regular conversations with the ESO around the access to the balancing mechanism. I think there's currently less than 1% of storage assets are used in the balancing mechanism. Our conversations have developed slightly further, because it was like, how can my fancy tech talk to your fancy tech? And they're like, sorry, our fax machine. It's like... the fax machine has now gone, but the tech isn't as fancy as it needs to be. And so, there is a huge... Admittedly, we don't want them installing fancy new tech that doesn't work, but there is a huge step change, a hockey stick curve, Jay used that analogy earlier, to go in terms of how advanced the technology is with all of our aggregators and our renewables assets versus who we're engaging with and the confidence in the control room and the person. And that also comes back to ministers as well. No minister wants the lights to go off, and they feel like they kind of need this big red button that they can push. And so, as we move to a kind of 2035 net zero power system, and we look at, the role of unabated gas and, moving that to a strategic reserve, or kind of what role that plays in the future, being mindful of how that plays out, I think is really important.
Brilliant. There is no answer so far, so we don't want NESO and we don't want central TV organisation. I'll let somebody else ask a question, but I've got one at the end. So I'm going to ask you at the end, so you can start thinking, what do we want? What one thing would you want to make it better? Any questions from the floor?
I just have one in the corner here. Hi, I'm Yasmin Howes and I'm in the energy team projects at Osborne Clark. I'm feeling very inspired. I think we all could run the country quite well in this room, actually. I wanted to ask on one particular thing. It's grid connection, and it comes up all the time in our work. Some people have mentioned it in the room already, and we've spoken about it. And I know, Kate, you spoke about how the same issues come up time and time again, and I'm definitely seeing that. And I wondered if it's become so strong, or if there's a way we can make it such a prominent feature that it's going to sort of transcend the political debate and we won't end up playing political football with it, because I know there are some things that are really important in the energy transition. So I'd just love to hear your opinions on that, whether that's possible, whether there are other things separate to grid connection which might fall into the same bucket. Thank you.
I'll kind of take that a little bit. So obviously we talked about earlier around the fact that just to get the number of connections that we need in London, we need £1 billion of investment. Now a lot of that comes down to everyone goes, oh, that's an energy policy. So DESNZ or whoever Ofgem and those guys need to really get hold of that and make that simpler, which is great. And yes, that directive does need to come from there. However, it goes back down to the fact that we have a ridiculous number of devolved planning powers across not just the UK, but obviously it goes back down to literally where you live. Your local council and your parish will decide whether or not you can have that connection in there. I'm still waiting. I live in a tiny little village outside of Dartford, and I go, oh yes, I live in Dartford. I go, oh, great. But I live in a tiny little village outside of Dartford. The other side of the road to me is a different postcode. They've got cable. So they have their fancy fast internet connection, and I'm still using the BT. And that is as far as we're going at the moment. We need the local planning powers to be able to actually say, yes, we need the connections here, here and here. But I also live, as I say, in a tiny little village. There is a huge kick-up fuss about having a 5G aerial on the fields opposite where I live, because everyone went, oh, we don't like 5G. And there is that huge amount of push that actually it needs to come from the top to say, you need these connections, it will make your life easier, and eventually, yes, hopefully, it will make your life cheaper when you get there. It will open up so many other opportunities to have these connections, but we need to be able to give the local planning authorities the remit to be able to actually get people plugged in. Grid's going to butt up against all of these people every single time. We just don't have that infrastructure that's there at the moment, and without having that directive from the top, however we get there, through NESO or whoever, but that direction needs to be there, and it needs to be there quickly, because otherwise that investment's not going to come in, Grid aren't going to be able to make those connections, and we're going to suffer from that.
So on connections, so Regen's doing a huge amount of work on connections. So there's kind of two different tracks at the moment. At the moment, there's the 3-point plan from the ENA and the 5-point plan from the ESO. Is that the right word? Yeah. And there's a lot of work on clearing out the connections queue at the moment and freeing out what they're calling zombie projects. So people that have got a project, but they might not have got any land rights, and they certainly haven't got any planning, and maybe they have no intention of building. And I don't know, for those of you that don't know, projects are sold on average before shovels go in the ground about 5 times. And so there's a lot of money to be made just by having a grid connection and then kind of pushing on. And then there's the kind of ESO are kind of looking at new connections, and then they're putting, so at the moment there's 35 gigawatts being added to the queue on a monthly basis at the moment, and so the queue is absolutely massive, about 600 gigawatts I think, which is way more than we'll ever need to get to net zero, and there's a big percentage of those projects that will never get built. So clearing them out, getting rid of them. And so today you can still apply for a connection under that existing connection arrangement. And I chaired a panel a couple of weeks ago, and that was basically with some developers, and they were really ambitious that their fellow developers who had projects and were holding onto connections were booted out of the queue in any which way to enable the projects that were real and viable to actually connect. And huge controversial and probably legal challenges brewing. Then there's the new connections, and that's the process that ESO are working on alongside their 5-point plan for existing connections, and that has some stage gates where you have to apply for a connection, and within a given time frame you then have to have land rights agreed, and then you have to apply for planning, and if you're not meeting your milestones and you're not progressing your project, and then you get booted out. Or there's a kind of first ready first connect process where if someone's already ahead of you, then they leapfrog you in the queue, and so on. And so when we get to that would be great, but we're a little way off getting to that. But I think there is huge ambition in the sector, and I guess hunger for getting this sorted, to enable the connections and to enable the stuff to get built.
I think also, just to kind of jump into that, there's a huge amount of pressure that needs to actually come from outside of our utilities industry. Google, for example, they're obviously creating huge numbers of server farms all around the country, not just here but in America. And one of the things that their head of they've got a green division in there to kind of look at how they can actually make themselves a bit more net zero. One of the things that they're actually saying to people in America and Texas and those sorts of states is that actually they would prefer to build in dirty areas, so areas which don't have that green generation in there, but on the premise that actually they get more generation which is greener getting into that. That's a huge corporation, a global corporation, which needs to be able to put pressure onto grid company, departments of business and trade and all of that, in order to be able to get them to force them to put the money where it needs to be, and force them to put the grid connections where they need to be. We've got grid connections which are sitting there which aren't being used because people don't want to put themselves there, because there isn't that green energy flowing or close by to it. But unless you've actually got pressure coming in from sort of grassroots up, as well as from the top down with a clear direction that yes, we will help you, I think you're just going to end up flatlining. No one's going to actually move. It's all that chicken and egg.
We should say there's at least 3 ex-Ofgem directors in the room, and so the role of Ofgem and how we can accelerate things, we could probably ask them.
I was just going to say, I think we've got to acknowledge this is a political context. All of this, these are all wonderful things, and we can make as strong a case as we can, but as long as MPs will literally resign from, a body because they are supportive of a new infrastructure build-out so they can better defend their constituency, because the second there is a local campaign against build-out, MPs, will by and large go, I'll vote against this. I mean, HS2, we've just spent, £60 billion to make it slower and worse to travel north of Birmingham. It is, why did that happen? Because, local constituency MPs said, I'll back this, pork barrel politics, whatever you want to call it. I'll back this if you make it nicer for my constituents. Hang the expense is what it looks like from the outside. I'm sure there were much more rational decisions made, but cumulatively the effect is the same. Campaign groups, and I love people, love democracy, but we've also got to be honest about what happens. People with certain interests who have time on their hands and the means to campaign will campaign against a thing because it is easier to campaign against something than it is to support it. An example I have, I'm so sorry, Joe, I will shut up in a minute. Right, an example I have is last year with the licences around, additional licences for the North Sea, oil and gas. Like the bat signal went up, everyone was up in arms and coordinated with one voice. This is terrible, this is so bad for the UK, because it is easy and it is morally satisfying to campaign against stuff. If you are trying to campaign for things, new things, build out, it is messy and practical, it's less morally sure, there's greater uncertainty. Campaign groups are harder to form. So, when it comes to planning reform or anything else, we've got to find ways constantly to not give in to campaign against something that feels really bad if it's not going to move the needle. And we have to instead work on ways of making good things happen rather than avoiding inefficiencies or avoiding a potential suboptimal outcome. And that's something on a human level I think we all have to consider for our organisations, but also when we engage with the public. Is the loudest voice an anti-campaign group because it's easier to have a single message to stand behind? It fits on a placard. Are there other voices that you can engage with and hear through other routes that are maybe a bit more messy, but are perhaps louder? You know, is the growth agenda more important to this community in the round? Is that something that's being taken into account too? So I think that just planning reform is going to be a nightmare. It's going to sound like everyone who has a voice hates it, and that will not be true. It's harder to hear those more fragmented voices.
So we have a local wind farm, and when I moved to the village that we're in, I was in the pub and I was like, I love the wind farm, it's amazing, like, isn't it brilliant? And it's got a great community benefit fund, and this is what we could do with it. And I genuinely love the wind farm. And so this lady came up to me and she was like, you are the first person who I've ever heard be positive about the wind farm. And you're talking publicly in the pub, you're not worried? And I was like, no, I'm not worried. No, I work in the sector. Like, you know, I'm interested in wind generally, and it was fascinating. Like now, like loads of people love the wind farm. No one really says anything negative about it. It's been in place for seven years, and everything that everyone was really worried about has all just dissipated. But the voices in the process of before it was built were just loud and. Yeah.
Great. And I think that really resonates as well in terms of that. We've covered a huge amount of ground here. We're in danger of being slightly pessimistic, and I'm an eternal optimist. So I'm going to ask each of you for one very, very quick, it's the sort of less than 30 seconds, one positive thing, or one thing to be optimistic about, or one change you'd like to see. Kate first, and I'm only going to give you seconds.
Let's be creative, right? As an industry, we always look to solve the last war. We always look for historical data sets. That is not how society has been moving over the last 20 years. So whatever you're doing, be creative, be imaginative. What is the problem 2 years, 20 years, 200 years from now? Keep that in mind rather than just looking to how things have performed in the past.
So I think a clean, affordable, power system is a win for any government. Kind of bringing it back to the politics here, and I think that we all just need to bring people with us. So to work on that messaging, to bring the greater public with us, to bring our friends and family with us, to talk in ways that people actually understand. It's not to look back at all the elections.
For me, it is to not think about how you've always done things. It's always to think about how you could do things. If you could start again, what would that look like? We have a ridiculous number of policies, political views and everything else, which are all very much based on history, how we've always done things. But if we want to actually get to where we need to be, and I think we are starting to, you do actually need to be quite more radical in a minute, and then work backwards to see how you can actually achieve that. Somewhere along the lines, you'll find a middle ground which actually ends up quite positive. You will progress through that, and I think that's where most of the political parties actually do need to start thinking.
Great. Thank you. I'd like to thank all our panellists. I think it's been a really good. We're at the end of the sort of formal session now, but we've got another hour of networking out there. Women's Unity Network. I really encourage everybody to stay on and have conversations. There's been so much talked about, so many ideas. We've given you all the content you need to talk about with different people. My plea always is please don't go and talk to people you already know, because the whole point is to go and talk to new people. I've already told people I've been all work for the same organisation. So that is what we're about. There's loads of content to talk about. Go and talk about your ideas, meet new people, and thank you very much. Great to see everybody, and thank you again to our brilliant panel.